Boo! I gotcha, didn't I? Well, don't worry, there won't be any more intense scares from this point forward. This channel is too lighthearted to be scary, and you know what else is? This game. The Upturned is an indie horror game with comedy thrown into the mix. It was developed by zeekerss, who is known for making Lethal Company and a bunch of other rather obscure horror games. I found Lethal Company to be an enjoyable multiplayer game, especially with friends. But what about a solo horror game experience? One that preceded Lethal Company by about a year and a half. A lot of elements in the Upturned carry over to Lethal. From the aesthetics, gameplay, and humor, they both share this sort of chaotic energy. zeekerss certainly has his own flair with his craft, but what exactly makes the Upturned a one-of-a-kind? A horror game that sticks out from the rest? Well, I'm Cab, the BugFishGaming nerd, and without further ado, this is my review on the Upturned. You are a lone traveler who arrives at a mysterious inn to stay at for the night. You're greeted by the strange but jolly innkeeper Ichabod, or just referred to as Ick. He's an odd fella, but friendly enough to help you check in. The Upturned Inn is one hell of a grand hotel, because there's 1,434 floors in it. Or at least there's that many, because the room Ick assigns you to is on floor 1434. No big deal, it might just take a while for the elevator to reach— the fuse went out. The storm outside is pretty bad, messing with the elevator's circuitry quite a bit that you can't travel several floors without the fuse breaking. It's a good thing every floor has a spare fuse lying around for these kinds of situations. But you'll quickly find out that you're not the only guest who's checked into the Upturned Inn. And unfortunately, you're the only humane guest, because everyone will try to kill you as you venture into the hotel's various floors to find those fuses. With your room's floor being in the quadruple digits, you're gonna have to outwit and maybe outfight your way through several floors to get a good night's rest. And while chaos ensues, Ick will contact you from time to time to ask about your well-being, and other arbitrary things. The gameplay loop of the Upturned is actually pretty simple. You're just going from floor to floor, getting those fuses, and getting back to the elevator. Along the way, you'll encounter some puzzles to solve, some platforming challenges, and of course, enemies you'll have to avoid or sometimes even fight. The main gameplay mechanic of the Upturned is you're able to grab any object that you see, and you can throw it. That's right, anything. You can grab tables, chairs, vases, books, food, and throw them. If you knock out these crow fellas, you can even grab their corpses and use them to take down more of them. You can throw these objects to activate switches or create platforms, and also combat enemies. And this is where part of the Upturned's humor comes into play, where you can just take entire tables and chuck them at enemies to defeat them. Or books, or brooms, or whatever's the funniest option to you. Haha, take this, watch some baseless news channels. Heck, you can even throw doors at them, right after ripping them off their hinges, because that's the only way to open doors in this game. The pacing of the game is pretty solid. Sometimes you'll get longer levels, sometimes shorter, levels that are more puzzle-focused or gauntlet-styled, where hordes of enemies are thrown at you and you have to survive. Some levels introduce new mechanics pertaining to certain objects, like fans and magnets that can blow away and pull objects towards you respectively, or even laser tag guns that actually shoot real lasers. Some levels are very maze-like, and it's best to have an escape plan in mind, as advised by Ick. Some enemies can't be defeated, and you can only run away from them. With that in mind, you might have to create platforms or move things out of the way to facilitate your escape. And maybe prepare a first aid kit somewhere along the path so you can grab it on your way back to the elevator. Overall, the floors and their challenges always feel refreshing and distinct from each other, especially the more thematic levels that I found more interesting. It never felt repetitive once. If I did have any nitpicks with this game, it would be the fact that if you die, you have to redo a whole section all over again, and sometimes the game sends you pretty far back. Though, I only died a few times, and it's really only a mild inconvenience. Who doesn't find death an inconvenience anyway? There are also bonus levels you can unlock by collecting chocolate bars on a floor. Why chocolate bars? I don't know. It's just one of the game's arbitrary things. Some of them can be challenging to collect because you might need to backtrack or find this hidden spot, but what's even more difficult are the bonus floors themselves, because they don't pull their punches. They are not required to beat the game, but it's nice that they're there after the credits roll. The atmosphere of this game is interesting, because it's technically a horror game, It's got a few scares, a few small jump scares here and there, but overall it's got a whimsical and silly nature that you can't really ignore. You could be chased by some giant monster and it will just call you at the most inappropriate times just to tell you about some nonsensical thing. And honestly, it's just really funny. The game has a good balance of jokes and spooky tension. Just when the tension gets really high, it will call you to lighten it up. The jokes are genuinely funny to me, and it's kinda weird that you would find this in a horror game. And it's often unexpected, making it all the more better. Like, right at the start of the game, you're told to type a first and last name for the character you play as, but the game deliberately cuts you off and you're stuck with that name. At first, I thought it was a bug or something, and then I realized it was 100% intentional. Sometimes the humor is hidden within the game's mechanics. You're able to focus your aim when you're holding an object, and if you focus the reticle on an enemy, it will reveal their name. I mean, they're guests, same as you, so it makes sense for them to be humane enough to have names, even if they seem random or out of place. You're never too on edge while playing the game because of all these humorous moments. But don't think you're safe just yet. Every floor could be a huge danger. Some of the enemies are genuinely spooky. Like this mimic fella, who disguises itself as any other normal object and leaps out at you if you get too close. And that really messes with me because you're typically trying to grab objects all the time, so all of a sudden you just have trust issues with grabbing objects. And some floors have pretty terrifying gimmicks. There's this one floor where your flashlight stops working, so you're more prone to being stuck in the dark. Or this other level where there's a bunch of static mannequins that you've seen throughout the game, but you know they're just gonna come to life eventually to kill you. And this level is straight out of Amnesia, with the water slug rushing to your position if you dare step into the water. I also like how the environment feels very self-contained. You're in a hotel, a building, which doesn't appear to have any windows. There's a natural reason for that, but that would be a bit of a spoiler. Just play the game, it's good. But since you're always in a building, you can't really truly run away from the threats that chase after you. And while every video game has its boundaries and invisible walls and whatnot, there's a thematic reason for why you can't leave the area. The horror aspect feels more immersive that way. And the elevator, the one binding factor of this game, that if for some reason you've forgotten you're in a hotel, is a constant reminder that you are in one, because you always have to return to it with the fuse. As you climb the floors, you anticipate how close you are to floor 1434, gazing at the small red numbers, even if this elevator moves at a snail's pace and breaks down so often. The short, simplistic tune that plays as you're waiting for the next floor you can't help but hum along to. Ick almost always calls you when you're in the elevator for a sanity check. All these little things I appreciate and would like to think that the elevator is almost like its own little hub world. Or at least when compared to elevators in other games, the Upturned's got its own unique personality. Other elements that make up the game's atmosphere are the music and visuals. The music never sounds scary, just strange and absurd, to put it. But some of the songs unironically slap and feel kinda funky. The visuals are pretty unique too. It doesn't look like the PS1 low poly graphics, which honestly I think that graphical style looks kinda ugly. But the Upturned blends elements of low poly and pixel visuals, and as a result you get this graphical style. The same style you see in Lethal Company. This, I can get behind. It just looks pleasant to look at, especially in a modern age where every AAA game is trying to go for the most realistic graphics ever. So it's nice that indie games like The Upturned have their own unique visuals. I think it's worth noting there's a bit of a story going on in the game too. It isn't exactly a very story-oriented game, but it's got one alright. A very silly one. About a third way through the game, you find out that the Upturned Inn is a hotel for the dead, and you're in the afterlife trying to find a place to rest. Throughout the game, it will call you and inquire about your backstory and how you died, but you can't remember, so he tries to find out the details for you. So you got this whole side plot going on where the innkeeper does everything in his power to sort through a box of files and papers detailing every person who has ever died, just to find out about you and your cause of death. And along the way, you and Nick discover bits and pieces about what has happened to the living world. And as unhinged as Ick is, he's a pretty good friend, better than most alive people these days. I mean, if I died and I had no recollection of my cause of death, I'd trust this guy 100%. He's not the only prominent character. You got this cute, I'm not sure what he is, but Ick calls him Shrimp. Doesn't look like one to me, but he's cool. There's also a character that has some semblance to an antagonist, who intrudes every now and then in your phone calls. The Fat Pajama Man. Not a speaking character, but he's a reoccurring enemy, one of the enemies you can't defeat. So when you see him, that's your cue to hightail it out of there. So, I feel like I've been avoiding the question of why this game is unique compared to other horror games, so I'm gonna answer that. Why is it a unique horror game? Well, for starters, you're not dealing with zombies or ghosts. You've got the Fat Pajama Man. But in all seriousness, the Upturned turns away from a lot of horror game cliches and horror cliches in general. It doesn't overload you with jump scares, and any jump scares the game has aren't in your face. A lot of horror games either lean hard into either being a walking sim or a more complex survival game with stats and an inventory and crafting system. But the Upturned leans hard into something that isn't explored in this thematic genre much, that being humor, and it does it masterfully. Without the overused cliches, it makes it more interesting to anticipate what happens next in the game. Will the next floor be humorous, or actually scary? Somehow that reinforces one of the best elements of a horror game, that being the unknown and not knowing what to expect. Probably best seen in Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Although I will say, if the Upturned is more humorous than scary, is it really a horror game? Well, under most circumstances, I'd probably say no. It would just be a tense survival game, but a lot of zeekerss games pertain to horror, and the Upturned and Lethal Company both share that element of the unknown. You don't know what level layout you'll get, or the monsters it will contain. Of course, the Upturned isn't randomized like Lethal, but they're still similar. In Lethal, the monsters aren't so scary when you and your friends are laughing your asses off, and the same effect is achieved in this game. But it's through you engaging with the story and its characters, and of course the same chaotic energy you'd find in Lethal. I find it cool that the dev was able to transmute this single-player game into a multiplayer experience that took the world by storm. Overall, I love this game because it's a survival horror, which is my cup of tea, but it never plays off like a typical horror game like Resident Evil or Outlast. It never truly takes itself seriously, just a simple game with simple mechanics, with some spooks perfectly sprinkled in to give it some tension. Anyway, that's about everything I have to say about the Upturned. It's worth the price tag, even better if you get it on sale. I wouldn't say it's my favorite horror game, but it's one of the most enjoyable ones I've played. Thanks for watching. It took me way longer than needed to make this video. It can be time consuming at times. Plus, I'm now going to college, so it's going to be interesting how I'll be going forward with this channel while dealing with that. But good news, I'm going to try and get a video out every month. And I have plans to get possibly 2 videos out within the coming October? Maybe. But I will try to push this channel to its limits. Have yourselves a good one and stay snazzy.